anyone with even a cursory knowledge of the 1986 explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger knows it was a national tragedy. But dig a little deeper and it's even more heartbreaking.
The 1986 explosion of the Challenger marked a tragic moment not only for the friends and loved ones of the 7 astronauts aboard the doomed shuttle, but for the nation as a whole. Let's explore how and where the Challenger's crew members were put to rest. The 1980s was something of a wide-eyed, optimistic period for NASA and spaceflight. Humans had landed on the moon in 1969, only 11 years prior at that point, and visions of the future were bold and bright. 1973 saw the European Space Research Organization and NASA agree to develop an orbital space laboratory. 1981 saw the first orbital space flight of a reusable space shuttle, and the public fully expected to go to Mars and beyond. Then the Challenger disaster happened on January 28, 1986.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger.
While some children tuned in live from school to watch in terror as the Challenger shuttle exploded 73 seconds after launch, most people watched the taped recording after the fact. The shuttle had set out on a somewhat unglamorous but important mission to set up a tracking and data relay satellite in orbit and launch a separate satellite to observe Halley's Comet as it swept through our system. Instead, all 7 crew members on board died after their shuttle ignited during launch due to faulty rocket design. Never again would NASA hurry a launch, and never again would excitement trump caution. Crew members Francis R. Dick Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Judith A. Resnick, Ronald E. McNair, Ellison S. Onizuka, Gregory B. Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe all lost their lives on that day. On March 9th, NASA announced that divers had found their cabin in the Atlantic Ocean, and it took until April 20th to recover it. Those remains were eventually cremated and commingled at Arlington National Cemetery, where they rest to this day. The Challenger crew were all smiles before the mission and happy to the point of jovial as each member spoke a couple of words of thanks to everyone present at the launch. In addition to mission specialists, of special note was Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, chosen out of 11,000 applicants.
Has it all hit you yet?
No, I don't think so. I still can't believe that I'm going to actually be going into that shuttle.
She and the rest of the crew probably lost consciousness due to a change in cabin pressure and died from lack of oxygen before their shuttle hit the water. That being said, it's possible that someone could have woken up during the 2-minute and 45 seconds that it took to descend to the ocean. Out of respect, officials didn't elaborate on the state of the crew members' bodies when they were recovered. Their cabin was reportedly largely intact. Some personal effects floated to the surface of the water, and other research materials were present inside the cabin. Beyond that, a report from NASA states, "Local security measures are being taken to assure that the recovery operations can take place in a safe and orderly manner. We really don't want to say anything else in deference to the families." However, it is known that the crew's remains were crushed and, quote, could not be recognized as human, as the New York Times wrote at the time. Body identification was conducted at Patrick Air Force Base Hospital, 25 miles from Cape Canaveral, by the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. As mentioned, the cremated remains of the Challenger crew were interred at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. All 7 of the remains were mixed and placed together at a memorial in Section 46, Grave 1129, while 2 of the crew members, Francis R. Dick Scobie and Michael J. Smith, also have graves of their own in the cemetery. The memorial features a fitting poem called High Flight, written by Royal Canadian Air Force pilot John Gillespie McGee Jr. in 1941. In part, the poem reads, "Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of." Numerous tributes have been written to the Challenger crew over the decades since their death, and there are additional monuments besides a memorial in Arlington National Cemetery that holds the crew's remains, along with a small monument in Montpelier, Vermont. Meanwhile, the Space Mirror Memorial at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida is a grand but simply designed mirrored surface of polished black granite that reflects the sky. It's currently inscribed with the names of 24 deceased astronauts, including those of the Challenger crew. From faulty O-rings to deadly weather and foreboding warnings, the engineers closest to the Challenger space shuttle knew what was wrong. So why didn't NASA step in? The Challenger was destroyed due to a faulty O-ring seal in one of its booster rockets, allowing burning gas to escape. The rubber O-rings weren't supposed to be burned by the gases resulting from liftoff, but that's exactly what happened during the testing phase. Shockingly, according to the Rogers Commission report, when it was found that the O-rings could be damaged, engineers at both NASA and Morton Thiokol, the company contracted to design and build the rockets, decided that the situation was undesirable but acceptable. A test in 1977 revealed another ominous problem. The rocket ignition could cause parts of the rocket's steel casing to bend outward, reducing the pressure on the O-rings. Keep in mind, the opposite was supposed to happen, with parts bending inward and helping the O-rings to seal properly. At this point, engineers began to sound the alarm. One characterized the current design as unacceptable in October 1977, and another stated in January 1978 that redesign was necessary to, quote, prevent hot gas leaks and resulting catastrophic failure. Despite this, nothing was changed. NASA had more than theory to go on after its second shuttle mission when the Space Shuttle Columbia flew in November 1981. When they recovered and examined the shuttle's right rocket booster, one of its primary O-rings had been eroded badly. The news was ultimately met with no action. Multiple subsequent shuttle missions during the 1980s showed O-ring damage, yet still the design wasn't changed.
We learned that little things that seem harmless can become catastrophic events.
By 1985, engineers at Morton Thiokol had another concern about the O-rings. Their concern was based around how the cold weather could loosen the O-rings' elasticity. Given that NASA's bevy of planned shuttle missions included winter launches, this was a problem. As told by NASA space flights, one of the engineers, Bob Ebling, wrote a memo in October 1985 entitled it Help, in the hope of finally drawing attention to the issue. No help came. On January 27, 1986, NASA called Morton Thiokol and asked how they felt about a launch in 18-degree weather, because the O-ring's lower threshold of safety was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineers, when hearing this, were aghast. Ebling called his team together, and they all agreed that a launch in such a temperature would be the death of the shuttle crew. In a teleconference with NASA, the engineers laid out why Challenger should not be launched the next morning and recommended that it not lift off in any temperature lower than 53 degrees Fahrenheit. As engineer Roger Beaujolais later recounted to NPR, a NASA official was appalled at the thought of waiting so long to launch. The clear, cold weather that night led to ice forming all over the launch pad, but NASA still decided to proceed. The crew were told about the ice when they were briefed on the weather that morning, but they weren't told about any concerns regarding the temperature's effects on the O-rings. To that effect, the mission was a go. As detailed by the Rogers Commission reports, Challenger's launch was scrubbed repeatedly for one reason or another. Had even one of those delays not occurred, the shuttle might have lifted off in safer temperatures. First, it was moved from January 22nd to January 23rd due to schedule ripples caused by the prior delay of another mission, SDS-61C, and then the Program Requirements Change Board moved liftoff to January 25th. After that, the after effects of SDS-61C's delay bumped Challenger again to January 26th. The evening before the new launch date, the mission was pushed off yet again due to a forecast of wind and rain, which turned out to be entirely wrong. As Gene Thomas, launch director for the Challenger mission, recalled, "We decided we would not launch on Sunday, and Sunday was a beautiful day. We missed an opportunity to launch." Challenger's crew were strapped in and ready to go on the morning of January 27th when another problem reared its head. A screw wouldn't release from the shuttle's crew hatch. A drill was brought in, but its battery was dead. According to NASA spaceflight, 9 more batteries were brought to the launch pad, and for reasons unknown, every single one went dead. Liftoff was finally pushed back one more time to January 28th.
What should have been a day heralded for education turned to tragedy in a split second.
At 11:38 a.m. on January 28th, Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center. Footage later showed that dark smoke began to jet from one of the right-side solid rocket booster's O-rings less than a second after liftoff began. The shuttle broke the sound barrier 40 seconds up, and at around 59 seconds, a plume of flame began to emit from the right-hand SRB. The crew wouldn't have known about this, as further evidenced by their yells of "woohoo" at 60 seconds, a mere quarter second before the flame began to contact the orbiter's massive external fuel tank. Per spaceflight now, even if the crew had known what was happening, there was nothing they could have done. Immediately afterward, the shuttle was torn apart as the external fuel tank erupted into a massive fireball. A few seconds later, an object was seen descending slowly by parachute. Several TV stations began to focus on footage of the object and the shock and confusion that followed. However, it was only the nose cap of one of the SRBs. Anyone in the know wouldn't have focused on the parachuting nose cap for long, because there was no way for the Challenger crew to have escaped from the shuttle. The Rogers Commission report noted that Columbia had ejection seats similar to those of an SR-71 Blackbird for its 4 test flights early on, but that was when only 2 people were flying. The seats were never meant to be in place for the actual shuttle missions when it was assumed that all risks would have been accounted for and resolved. NASA had, in fact, considered full crew ejection options back in 1971 when the shuttle was being designed. They examined the feasibility of conventional ejection seats, encapsulated seats, and a whole detachable crew compartment. The problem was the cost of integrating any of these options into the design. Open seats would have cost $10 million, encapsulated seats would have cost $7 million, and the crew compartment option would have added a whopping $292 million to the bill. After the Challenger disaster, the idea of an astronaut escape system was examined once again. A number of designs were considered, but as before, all of them were ultimately rejected due to the difficulty of their implementation. Per the Rogers Commission reports, recovery efforts began within an hour of Challenger's breakup, but the crew wouldn't be found until March 1986. Off the Florida coast, 2 divers came across the crew cabin on the seabed approximately 100 feet below the surface. It was a wreck of twisted metal and wires, and the divers didn't know what they'd found until they saw a spacesuit bobbing in the water. Low on air, the 2 men marked the location and swam for the surface. The next day, the USS Preserver came to recover the lost astronauts. As detailed by NBC News, that was easier said than done. Between the crash and the time spent underwater, their remains weren't in good shape, having at times to be removed in parts. First, Judy Resnick was recovered, followed by Krista McAuliffe. After this, it was determined that the jagged, jumbled cabin would have to be raised from the ocean in order to continue. As the crane pulled the cabin to the ship, a splash of blue appeared on the surface. It was the jump-suited body of Gregory Jarvis, which had become free as the cabin was raised. As the crew of the Preserver watched in dismay, it sank below the waves again. A search for Jarvis immediately ensued, during which astronaut Robert Crippen even hired his own boat to help. Jarvis wouldn't be found again for another 5 weeks, 200 yards from where he'd been lost. After failing to convince NASA to stop Challenger's January 28th launch, Morton Thiokol engineer Roger Boisjoly was sent home. As detailed by NASA Spaceflight, Boisjoly, fearing the worst, had no intention of watching the launch, but fellow engineer Bob Ebeling convinced him to do so. When the shuttle seemed to lift off just fine, a wave of relief washed over the engineers until they saw the fireball. Everyone present knew just what had happened. Despite his efforts, Boisjoly felt responsible for the 7 astronauts' deaths, as did Ebeling. Over the following months, the once bulky Boisjoly lost quite a bit of weight and became plagued by headaches, insomnia, and depression. He testified to the Rogers Commission and also sued both NASA and Morton Thiokol. However, his lawsuits weren't successful, and Boisjoly's actions led to his shunning by some of his colleagues, worsening his despair. As told by his wife to NPR, Boisjoly did eventually find peace, however, through speaking to engineering schools about the disaster, which he continued to do until his death in January 2012. According to a report by NASA scientist Joseph P. Kerwin, when the Challenger broke apart, its crew, protected by the cabin, wouldn't have been killed or even seriously injured. But were they still conscious as they fell toward the sea? The answer is unclear. After the orbiter was torn apart, the sturdy crew cabin began to freefall. The central question is how quickly the cabin depressurized. On the ocean floor, the cabin was a mangled mess, but that was due to its impact. Given the damage, it couldn't be determined whether there'd been any breach in the cabin before the crash. There is one chilling indicator of the crew's fate.
Challenge is fast, launch is fast. It's bang, and then it's a 2-minute ride down. And you're conscious, we know that.
Of the 4 personal egress air packs, or PEAPs, that were recovered, 3 had been activated before the impact. However, Kerwin noted that the PEAPs may have been activated instinctively due to depressurization right at breakup, in which case they wouldn't have kept the astronauts awake, as they only provided regular air. For what it's worth, per NBC News, 3-time shuttle commander Robert Overmyer, who participated in the cabin's recovery, is certain that the Challenger's astronauts were conscious. Tragically, there was no chance of survival when the cabin struck the ocean at 207 miles per hour. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger took to the skies for a brief 73 seconds before a fiery demise. Here's what happened minute by minute. Leading up to the Challenger disaster, most people thought it perfectly reasonable to think of the Space Shuttle like an airplane, reusable, reliable, comfortable, and safe.
I think it's going to be very exciting for kids to be able to turn on the TV and see the spaces for everybody.
But there was a massive problem with risk analysis. A 3-volume study, first published in 1979, estimated that the chances of a shuttle breaking up on launch, exactly like Challenger did, were between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. The weakest point? Solid fuel rocket boosters. Fast forward to 1983, and another study suggested the risk of a shuttle breakup was closer to 1 in 100. After the Challenger disaster, physicist Richard P. Feynman explained, "The higher figures, 1 in 100, come from working engineers, and the very low figures, 1 in 100,000, from management." The Challenger accident resulted in the establishment of a program that would collect data, including flight and test data, for risk assessment, which was something new. Before the tragedy, NASA didn't think it was necessary, and that kind of explains how certain egregious oversights occurred. Prep for Challenger's launch was a months-long process that began in 1984 and included 37 weeks of crew training. In fact, the date of the disaster wasn't the original launch date. After a flight readiness review on January 15th, launch times and dates were changed multiple times to account for the possibilities of aborted landings and the best time to view Halley's Comet, which, along with deploying the Spartan satellites, was a big part of Challenger's mission. The mission date was pushed back several times, and NASA eventually landed on a launch date of January 22, 1986. The story gets more complicated as delays plagued the mission in the days leading up to its eventual launch. That particular January was exceptionally cold, and with temperatures dropping well below freezing, it was clear that Challenger would be launching in temperatures that no shuttle had ever launched in before.
Even though we understood that we could have a catastrophic failure, NASA wanted to have increased number of launches.
Launch was pushed back from the 26th to the 27th because of weather concerns, and on the 27th, Challenger got very close to leaving the launch pad. The Challenger crew was ready on the morning of January 27th, and according to NASA records, everything was going according to plan. Shuttle preparations began at 12:30 a.m., and after waking up at 5:07 a.m., the crew was strapped into their assigned positions in the shuttle at 7:56 a.m. About an hour later, Challenger's crew alerted control to a door ajar signal. The problem was with an exterior hatch. After the ground crew secured the door, they couldn't remove the exterior handle. The screws that held it in place were frozen. Over the course of 2 hours, ground crews struggled to remove the hatch handle with screwdrivers, a drill, and a hacksaw, and by the time they finally managed to get it off, the crew had been sitting in place for 5 hours and the launch window had passed.
I thought, gee, this is more like watching a rerun of the Three Stooges than launching a space shuttle.
Kennedy Shuttle Chief Bob Seek issued a statement saying, "It was just not our day. Our plan is to recycle and go for Tuesday morning." The Challenger disaster came very close to not happening, and if it had been up to engineers from Morton Thiokol, it wouldn't have. Morton Thiokol is the company that made the O-rings that were ultimately blamed for the accident. On January 27th at around 1 p.m., NASA reached out to Thiokol to ask whether the cold could cause problems. Management spoke among themselves, convened with engineers by 2:30 p.m., and at 5:45 they conferenced with NASA to recommend scrubbing the launch. After more discussion, another conference was called for 8:45 p.m. Engineer Roger Bougele argued that the O-rings weren't designed to function in the kind of freezing weather Florida had been experiencing.
There was not one positive statement for launch ever made in that room.
Simply put, the O-ring is a rubber gasket that seals in hot gases produced during solid fuel launches. When the rubber gets too cold, it's not flexible enough to seal completely, and launching with improperly set O-rings could mean leakage and ultimately disaster. On the basis of engineer recommendations, Thiokol heads stated that no launch should be undertaken in temperatures below previously tested conditions of 53 degrees Fahrenheit. That was their stance until 10:30 p.m. Arguments over the safety concerns created by the temperature were going nowhere when contractor Morton Thiokol and NASA ended their conference to discuss matters further and reconvene. When they did, it was to make recommendations that would doom the Challenger and crew. The teleconference picked up again at 11 p.m. Bougele would later explain, "It is hard to understand how those at NASA and Marshall could have thought the Challenger flight ready unless they presumed that unless the engineers could show that the flight would fail, then it would succeed." In other words, Thiokol engineers couldn't show concrete proof that the O-rings were going to fail, so it was decided that they would be fine.
If you don't keep your schedule, you don't keep your budget. So I put the pressure on myself, just as a matter of pride.
Executives at Thiokol faxed over their signed affidavit that the Challenger was all right to launch at 11:45 p.m., even as some at NASA continued to argue that the launch wasn't a good idea. January 28th, launch day. Overnight temperatures had once again been well below freezing, and at 1:35 a.m., crews were dispatched to the launch site to decide whether or not ice was going to be a problem. At the same time, hardware issues with the ground liquid hydrogen storage tank were discovered, which set fueling time back. At 3 a.m., inspection teams submitted their report for consideration, and the countdown continued. That delay, however, pushed things back a bit. The crew was scheduled for a wake-up at 6:18, but they were all reportedly awake as debate over the mission continued. As early as 5 a.m., there was another discussion about O-rings, but it wasn't even mentioned at the 9 a.m. meeting to discuss the findings of a second inspection of the launch site. When that had started at 7 a.m., ice and cold temperatures were still a major concern, but the launch remained on track.
A lot of people had this gut feeling that this just doesn't feel right.
The Challenger's launch delay meant that the crew had extra time to prepare. According to NASA reports, they took their time over breakfast. And while they were briefed on things like weather conditions and temperature, there's a horrible little footnote buried in the official logs reading, "Neither then nor in earlier weather discussions was the crew told of any concern about the effects of low temperature on the shuttle system."
How could they live with themselves for making a decision like that?
The media was there, including CBS Radio News reporter Frank Motek. A year after the disaster, he recalled watching the crew get ready, saying, "We watched the crew members gather together for breakfast, take their trip to the launch pad, put on their spacesuits, and board their spaceship. We saw Krista McAuliffe smile as a technician gave her an apple." The crew arrived at the launch pad at 8:03. 33 minutes later, they were strapped in and ready to go. 8 minutes later, another ice inspection resulted in another delay, with yet another ice inspection wrapping up at 11:15. Then it was go time. Launch began at 11:38 a.m. At minus 6.6 seconds, the engines ignited, and the solid rocket boosters ignited as the countdown hit 0. 7 seconds later, a roll program was heard from the Challenger flight deck. Houston replied, "Roger, Challenger." At 65 seconds, Houston gave another instruction to the shuttle crew.
"Challenger, go with throttle up." "Roger, go with throttle up."
Then, 73 seconds after the countdown had reached 0, signal was lost. NASA maintains that everything was normal. Processes and procedures were going as planned, there were no alarms or warnings, and then suddenly there was nothing. On the ground were about 500 people, including neighbors of shuttle pilot Michael J. Smith and friends of Krista McAuliffe. From their point of view, things happened almost instantaneously. By the time the sound of liftoff reached them, they saw the flash burn in the fiery clouds. Eerily, NASA has stated that the first indication they had that things were terribly wrong was the same moment etched into the memories of countless students watching the launch in their schools via satellite link, the moment the shuttle began to break apart.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink.
Challenger launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, under the watchful eye of Houston's Mission Control. While it took just 73 seconds for the Challenger mission to go terribly wrong, the New York Times reported that in the minutes following the disaster, Mission Control continued to report that everything was fine. In fact, 105 seconds after launch, Public Affairs Officer Stephen A. Nesbitt was still tracking Challenger on radar, only he wasn't.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
That July, it was widely reported that NASA had released evidence that suggested the crew was at least briefly aware of things going wrong. NASA was never the same after the Challenger disaster. Almost immediately, experts were sent scrambling to figure out what happened and why it was someone else's fault. One of the experts they called in, who only reluctantly agreed to be part of the investigation, was physicist Richard Feynman, who had previously worked on the Manhattan Project, diagrammed the interaction between light and matter, and won a Nobel Prize.
I personally doubt that they're touching the face of God, so I prefer to show my respect by finding the cause of their appalling deaths and not stand around looking sad.
Feynman was promised NASA's full cooperation, but he would later write that the whole process was, quote, in reality, sitting around doing nothing most of the time. So he took matters into his own hands, headed to NASA headquarters, and instead of chatting with NASA management, he spoke with engineers before he was barred from the building. He'd already caught wind of the dispute over the O-rings, and then he took part in the Rogers Commission hearings. There were two important moments. One was Feynman's demonstration, with the help of pliers, a clamp, an O-ring, and some ice water, of how rigid, inflexible, and ready-to-leak O-rings became when subjected to cold temperatures.
There's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees.
The other was 7 words from Morton Thiokol rocket booster director Alan McDonald, who, after NASA denied they were aware of problems, stood up to say, "Mr. Chairman, we recommended not to launch." In April 1986, NASA announced that recovery operations were finished, most of the shuttle had been recovered, and the remains of all 7 astronauts had been retrieved. Operations had focused on an area 17 miles off the coast of Florida. They added, "Final forensic work and future planning in accordance with family desires will be completed within the next several days and will be announced when appropriate."
It was in a fairly shallow water. The crew members are there, inside this intact compartment.
Descriptions of the scene were pretty awful, with the wreckage described as little more than a pile of rubble on the ocean floor, 8 feet high and 50 feet across. The astronauts' remains were crushed inside the debris and could not be recognized as human. Not all pieces of the Challenger had been recovered, though. In 1996, 2 pieces, parts of the left inboard wing flap, washed ashore at Florida's Cocoa Beach. They weren't small pieces either. One 8 by 14 foot piece required heavy machinery to move it. Then, fast forward to 2022, divers looking for a World War II-era rescue plane and filming for a History Channel special about the Bermuda Triangle found a 20-foot-long piece of Challenger. They turned their findings over to NASA, who issued a statement that read in part, "This discovery gives us an opportunity to pause once again to uplift the legacies of the 7 pioneers we lost. and to reflect on how this tragedy changed us.
I think my philosophy of living is to get as much out of life as possible.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
The 1986 Challenger disaster was one of the worst space-related catastrophes in history. The crew members on board didn't even make it to space before their shuttle tore apart and its components exploded one by one.
Oh, that's just incredible. It's just devastating.
All 7 either died on the way down to the Atlantic Ocean or when the broken remnants of their craft struck the surface of the water.
Pieces falling out of the sky in the Florida morning. It's about 20 till noon in Florida.
Some school children saw the disaster unfold live on television from their classrooms, while millions of others watched the footage on the news throughout the day. As the full NASA transcript reads, the crew members did their jobs in their final 5 minutes of life, joked around a bit, seemed in good spirits, and commented on some irregularities in the instrument readings. 4 of the Challenger's 7 crew members have a voice in their mission's first and final 5 minutes. Commander Francis R. Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Ellison S. Onizuka, and mission specialist Judith A. Resnick. The Challenger crew was unique because it also included Krista McAuliffe, a teacher and the first civilian in space selected for the mission out of 11,000 applicants.
And our dream come true, but not really.
Space flight today really seems safe.
The transcript starts a bit over 3 minutes before liftoff and mostly consists of small phrases and confirmations between crew members. NASA also chimed in with statements and reminders here and there. The crew members joked around, and the mood reads as light but professional. When NASA asked about the shuttle oxygen vent cap, for instance, Onizuka joked, "Doesn't it go the other way?" And the whole crew laughed.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
When NASA told the shuttle to start rolling 11 seconds into launch, pilot Michael J. Smith, a Vietnam veteran, said, "Go, you mother." The helium in the right engine was lower than ideal, but otherwise everything seemed fine. At 1 minute 10 seconds, Scobie told Smith to throttle up. 3 seconds later, Smith said, "Uh-oh," and communications cut out that very second. The transcript in question comes from Operational Recorder Number 2, a piece of equipment on the space shuttles that usually gets reviewed after missions to help compose a full portrait of how things went. As UPI reported at the time, investigators fished Ops Recorder Number 2 out of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of 100 feet, 18 miles offshore. The tape was cleaned and analyzed, and that's how we know what the crew of the Challenger said in their final minutes of life. Besides helping us memorialize the Challenger's crew, the tape helped investigators identify exactly what caused the shuttle's destruction. If pilot Michael J. Smith said "uh-oh" before the Challenger broke apart, the reasoning went, then he must have had some clue that something was wrong, even only for an instant. Explorers off the Florida coast are almost certain to forever be reminded of one of the greatest tragedies in space travel history. They've been finding pieces of the Challenger space shuttle for nearly 40 years. One of the most heartbreaking disasters in NASA's history was the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle on January 28, 1986, just 73 seconds after liftoff. All 7 astronauts on board were killed. After a lengthy investigation, experts determined that cold overnight temperatures caused the O-ring seals in the booster rockets to fail. The tragedy resulted in NASA halting shuttle missions for 2 years as it worked on improving shuttle features.
NASA has appointed a committee of top engineers and scientists to investigate the catastrophe. Orders have been issued to impound all records concerning the flight.
Almost 40 years later, parts of the shuttle were accidentally discovered on the ocean floor by a television documentary crew. They were looking for World War II aircraft wreckage for history production. NASA confirmed in November 2022 that the discovery was indeed fragments from the Challenger. In a NASA article about the debris, the agency confirmed, divers noticed a large human-made object covered partially by sand on the sea floor. The proximity to the Florida Space Coast, along with the item's modern construction and presence of 8-inch square tiles, led the documentary team to contact NASA. Some of the shuttle, hundreds of pounds of metal, was recovered from the ocean within 24 hours of the horrific accident. The remains of the crew were found inside the cabin in March 1986. NASA found enough of the shuttle to conclude its investigation, but most of Challenger remains in the ocean. The Associated Press reports that around 118 tons of Challenger debris have been recovered in the years since the crash, about 47% of the shuttle. That means more than half of the craft is still unaccounted for. The New York Times reports that half of the orbiter and boosters, 2/3 of the external fuel tank, and 1/4 of the satellite payload have yet to be recovered. Some of the pieces recovered are on display in a NASA exhibit called Forever Remembered at Florida's Kennedy Space Center. The exhibit includes wreckage and astronaut artifacts not only from the Challenger shuttle, but also the Columbia shuttle, which exploded on re-entry in 2003. One piece of the Challenger wreckage is part of the fuselage that bears an American flag.
The hard sacrifice that was made by the crews of Space Shuttle Challenger and Columbia will now be shared with people in the future.
The 2022 debris recovery wasn't the first time that pieces of the Challenger shuttle were inadvertently discovered. The New York Times reports that in 1991, fishermen found a small tank and a metal fragment a few feet off Cape Canaveral. The fragments were also allegedly from the left wing of the craft. In December 1996, 2 sections of the shuttle washed ashore at Cocoa Beach, 20 miles south of Kennedy Space Center. The Tampa Bay Times reported that beachgoers found 2 sections of the Challenger's left inboard wing flap covered in barnacles in the early morning hours. One piece measured about 8 by 14 feet, and the other was about 5 feet long and 1 foot wide. NASA reportedly put the wreckage with the other 5,000 recovered pieces of the shuttle in 2 silos. The deadly failed launch of the Challenger space shuttle was one of the most shocking disasters in American history, but it didn't come out of nowhere. From faulty equipment to the fates of the astronauts, keep an eye out for these misleading myths. Many accounts of the Challenger disaster make it seem as if nearly everyone in the United States was watching the launch live, but the reality is that relatively few people actually tuned in as it was happening. Because the Challenger launched shortly before noon Eastern Time, most people were at work or school and thus couldn't sit in front of a TV. Few networks were broadcasting the launch anyway. That doesn't mean that there weren't some live viewers. At the time, CNN was one of the only channels that bothered to set up a live feed. A few others were able to take advantage of satellite broadcasts to see the launch, but the technology was new and not widely available. However, NASA had arranged for some schools to show their students a live broadcast. Thus, a significant portion of those who witnessed the disaster in real time were shocked school children. They included some of the New Hampshire-based students of Krista McCullough, a high school social studies teacher who was among the 7 astronauts on the shuttle.
How many times have I told you about Krista McCullough and the teacher in space?
3 times.
I wanted to be the teacher in space, and she beat me out.
When viewing the footage of the Challenger disaster, it's easy to conclude that the shuttle exploded. There's a large fireball, quickly followed by the disintegration of the rocket and shuttle, but a closer look shows that the breakup technically wasn't an explosion at all. Essentially, the root cause of the disaster was a fuel leak in the shuttle's right solid fuel rocket booster. During the launch, the escaping fuel caught fire, weakening connections between the booster and the large liquid fuel rocket. Eventually, the booster broke loose, swung around, and pierced the liquid fuel tank, releasing liquid oxygen. The liquid hydrogen fuel tank had also already been compromised by the fire and had begun to leak as well. When the 2 fuels mixed, they ignited and created the large fireball. However, the boosters actually survived this catastrophic failure and continued flying on their own until NASA officials remotely detonated them over the Atlantic. The shuttle also survived the fireball, at least for a short while. It continued flying for a moment, but soon after breaking away from the fuel tanks, the aerodynamic forces acting upon it tore the craft apart. Ultimately, while the fireball was quite dramatic, it had few of the auditory or physical effects of an explosion, such as a shock wave or loud noise. Some examinations of the Challenger disaster point not just to faulty O-rings, but also issues with the putty used to help seal those joints. Moreover, some have gone so far as to blame an environmental push for the disaster, saying that a move away from heat-resistant asbestos putty was a contributing factor to the failure. But while the putty sealant had been replaced, that was done before any such regulatory change came into effect. In fact, the replacement putty also included asbestos. Some sources claim that the new sealant's asbestos came in the form of longer, thicker fibers that may have weakened the sealing properties of the putty. However, it's not clear that this was a major factor in the joint failure. What may have been a more serious issue were the tests that NASA conducted on those joints. According to the Rogers Commission report, engineers had suggested the joint leak checks forced air through the putty and O-rings, creating blowholes in the putty that may have weakened the joint. Ultimately, however, whether or not the putty contained the right kind of asbestos likely didn't matter, as investigators concluded that the source of the disaster wasn't in the putty at all, but rather the O-ring seal. First-hand accounts of the Challenger disaster make it clear that NASA officials were anxious to move the launch forward. Some sources have claimed that President Reagan wanted it to happen before the upcoming State of the Union so that he could have a call with the astronauts during his speech. But this was reportedly just a rumor, and indeed Reagan delayed the State of the Union by 1 week.
This is truly a national loss.
If the pressure wasn't coming from the president, then where did it originate? It may well have been from inside NASA itself. The agency had been combating flagging interest in the space program, poor internal and external communication practices, and general frustration stemming from previous launch delays. It would be easy to think that something went wrong with the Challenger shuttle itself. After all, like all the other space shuttles, it had main engines on the craft in addition to the rocket boosters meant to get it into orbit. Those engines used liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which were mixed to combust and provide power. However, the truth is that the Challenger worked fairly well. For a brief moment or two after the fuel rockets failed, it continued flying on its own, though the intense physics of its high-speed, uncontrolled flight through the atmosphere soon caused it to break apart. If not attached to the rocket, the shuttle could have theoretically been able to return to Earth as a glider under minimal power. Ultimately, the Rogers Commission found that the shuttle's main engines had nothing to do with the accident. NASA continued using the engines for later launches and remained so confident in the main engine design that it's even using it as part of the next phase of its rocket missions. It's fair to say that once a Challenger launched, there was little chance of escape. According to the Rogers reports, early on in the shuttle program, a thrust termination procedure was considered. This would have allowed for the rocket boosters to stop firing mid-flight, allowing crew members to evacuate the vehicle. However, this proved to be tricky in practice. The aerodynamic forces that bore down on a shuttle mid-launch were quite significant, and NASA engineers concluded that reinforcing the shuttle for a mid-launch abort procedure would have added more than 19,000 pounds to the vehicle. The idea was largely out of consideration by 1973 and certainly wasn't part of the plan in 1986. In the aftermath of the disaster, this notion was revisited, but it was quickly disregarded in favor of a mid-flight escape maneuver that would have astronauts bailing out of a side hatch and then parachuting off a telescoping pole. Ejection seats were impractical in the shuttle's two-floor crew cabin, while similar rocket-powered techniques sometimes tore test dummies to pieces. While the bailout plan was tested by Navy personnel and astronauts were trained to complete it, the maneuver was never needed and certainly wouldn't have helped the Challenger astronauts.
Nobody planned for anything like this.
Cold weather was rightfully considered a major factor in the Challenger disaster. However, putting all the blame on low temperatures doesn't offer the fullest picture of what happened. Issues with the O-rings had already been known to officials and were observed after launches on higher temperature days. Furthermore, investigators suggested that the rocket section joints had further issues. These included a sealant putty that may have contained enough air holes that could have directed heat and fuel towards the O-rings, damaging them further. But perhaps the biggest problem of all wasn't the result of the damaged O-rings or faulty putty, but an inflexible decision-making process. NASA officials were clearly anxious to go forward with the launch. They were pushed along by the desire to deploy scientific equipment at the right time, avoid expensive delays, and recapture flagging public interest in the nation's space program. Some have also suggested that Krista McAuliffe's schedule played a role. She was set to teach on the fourth day of the mission, meaning a delay would have had her teaching on the weekend with no children in school. Perhaps the most ridiculous myth surrounding the Challenger disaster is the idea that at least some of the 7 astronauts managed to survive, or rather that they never got on the shuttle in the first place, knowing that they were taking part in a murky conspiracy meant to control the public via a media-ready catastrophe. According to this theory, the disaster was orchestrated to traumatize young people and make them more compliant. But evidence for this notion is pretty shaky, as it's based on claims that living professionals and academics are the surviving astronauts. If so, they're not exactly doing a good job at laying low. For instance, why would astronaut Judith Resnick fake her death and take on a new life as a high-profile Yale academic with the same name? Similarly, the theory that Ellison Onizuka took on the identity of his brother Claude generates a new mystery regarding the whereabouts of the original Claude. At any rate, a careful look at the details associated with the genuine astronauts and their supposed doubles shows multiple discrepancies in basics like graduation dates and physical appearances. Unfortunately, it's far more plausible that all of the Challenger's astronauts really did die, as their bodies were recovered from the Atlantic Ocean.
No matter how much you grieve, it won't do any good, it won't bring them back. So I just have to accept it.